Last class, you learned about some people that have done some pretty great things during their lives, like Harriet Tubman and Malcolm X. But have you ever stopped and wondered, how do we know what we know about history? Some of these people lived over 100 years ago, so how do we really know about the great things that they did? Well, in history, we have to look at many different sources of information. For example, what if you wanted to learn about Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, you'd have to look at many different sources of information. You could check out books from the library. That would give you some information. You could even look at letters and speeches that he wrote. That would give you even more information. Nowadays, you can sometimes even go on YouTube and watch videos and learn even more information. This is a video of Martin Luther King giving a speech. This is a great source of information. Now, today we're going to learn about some of these new sources of information that we can use to learn more about history. We're going to learn 4 new words, and these definitions are going to help you fill out part 1 of your worksheet labeled Sources of Information. The first word is biography. A biography is the story of a person's life. Fill in the definition of a biography on your worksheet. So if I'm studying Martin Luther King Jr., I can look at a biography of his life. These books are even labeled biography, so I know what to expect when I look inside. I'm going to find information about what his childhood was like, what his adulthood was like, and some of the great things that he did during his lifetime. Sometimes we're really lucky and we actually find an autobiography. An autobiography is the story of a person's life written by that person. Remember when we studied Malcolm X? Malcolm X actually wrote his own autobiography. So he wrote his story of his life. It's the story of Malcolm X's life written by Malcolm X. What a great source of information. Fill in the definition of autobiography on your worksheet. The next word we're going to learn is encyclopedia. An encyclopedia is a book of articles. Encyclopedias have lots of information, and sometimes it doesn't all fit in one book, and encyclopedias are made up of many different books. It's a whole set of books. Sometimes you can find encyclopedias that have articles just on one subject. This is an encyclopedia of Native American tribes, so inside I'm going to find articles about different Native American tribes. A lot of people nowadays use a online encyclopedia known as Wikipedia. You can look up different subjects like Louisiana and check out articles on these different subjects. And it's a great source of information. The next source of information we're going to find is an almanac. An almanac is a book of facts, all right? So they usually come out every year. They're going to have facts about all different pieces of information that you might be wondering about. What the weather's like, who the president of different countries are, what the population of different cities is. Sometimes you'll even find almanacs that have sports information, and it'll be a list of facts about different sports. That'll be scores and statistics on different players and teams. Now, that's 4 new types of information, sources of information that we've learned. But there's 2 main types of information that we need to learn. There's primary sources and secondary sources. Remember when we talked about Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, some of these sources are written by Martin Luther King Jr. himself, or by people who actually met him during their lifetime. Those are going to be the letters and speeches that we see over here. Some of these sources aren't like that. Some of these sources were written after he died, and those sources are called secondary sources. Those are written by people who didn't actually meet Martin Luther King Jr., but instead they studied him and studied his speeches and his letters and wrote books. So the first type of source we have is a primary source. Primary sources are written by someone who is actually there. Examples are letters, diaries, autobiographies, and speeches. So if we find a letter that was written by Martin Luther King Jr. or by his best friend, that letter was there at the time that he was living. And that's going to be a primary source of information about Martin Luther King Jr. and his life. But what about these sources over here, these books that we get at the library? These are also very important sources of information. These are secondary sources of information. These are written after the event. This is going to be encyclopedias like Wikipedia, textbooks, brain pop videos, and magazine articles. And me, I'm a secondary source. Most of the books written about Martin Luther King Jr. were written by people who didn't actually meet him. They're written after the event. They're secondary sources. So this autobiography of Malcolm X, that's a primary source. It was written by himself, so he actually was there at the time. Encyclopedias, that's going to be a secondary source. The people who wrote those articles weren't actually there when it happened. Now, I have some sources over here behind me, some more examples. First is a set of slave narratives. Slave narratives are stories written by slaves hundreds of years ago. So, if I want to study slavery and I have slave narratives, I have a primary source. These slaves were actually there when it happened, and so this is a primary source. Now, I also have these books. These are biographies. One is about Thomas Jefferson, and one is about Thomas Edison. These are secondary sources. The people who wrote these books weren't actually there and didn't actually meet these people. They're written after they lived to tell us about them. So this is all you need to know today about primary and secondary sources. You're going to get readings in the future to help you practice. On the back of your worksheet, you're going to sort different sources that you could use to learn about Native Americans into primary sources and secondary sources. The sources written by people who were actually there, and the sources that were made after. All right, we'll talk more later. Have a good week.